Welcome to On the Go with AAUW, the American Association of University Women. I'm your host, Jennifer DeSano, the Executive Director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University. And today on the program, we will be discussing the nonprofit Just Neighbors, which offers legal advice and services for immigrants and refugees. Our guest today is Erin McKenney. She is the Executive Director of Just Neighbors. Hi, Erin. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to learn a little about you before we get into the organization itself, Just Neighbors. What is your background? What led you to wanting to work at Just Neighbors?
I had a 20-year career with Verizon, and when I left there, I was doing a lot of mission work with my church. I started working at a day shelter where we were feeding many of the poor and the homeless in the Colmore, Bailey's Crossroads area. And after doing that for about 7 years, one of the things I realized is I was interested in doing something that was more justice-oriented. And when you feed people, they need to be fed, but they're hungry 5 hours later, and we weren't really able to do anything to change their conditions. And over my time there, I realized that many of them were immigrants and were undocumented, and really didn't have a means to change their conditions. And the opportunity at Just Neighbors came along, and it seemed like a perfect fit to do something that was more justice-oriented and hopefully help some of those folks address a need that they have.
And you've been there for about 3 years now.
Right.
Okay, right. And so let's talk about Just Neighbors and its origins, and walk us through some of perhaps the mission of the organization as well.
Well, the organization started in the basement of a church in the Colmore community by a couple pastors and attorneys who recognized that particularly poor immigrants had very little access to legal services in terms of helping to get their documentation. It wasn't affordable, and it just generally wasn't available. So they started this ministry that was both a law firm and a ministry in terms of trying to connect non-immigrant members of the community to the immigrant population so that they would build community and understand each other and know their stories rather it being the other. Folks could really get involved and connect with the immigrant community. So that started in 1996. We moved out of the basement of a church into office buildings. We're now located in Annandale with the same mission, a little bit expanded, but we serve low-income immigrants below 200% of the poverty level, which for a family of four is just under $50,000 a year. And we help them apply for and hopefully obtain some form of documentation, whether it's a temporary status or a permanent status. It depends on their individual case. And we're serving about 700 clients a year, and it's getting more and more complicated, but we do everything, again, from the temporary status and the permanent status, and we do some citizenship. So our goal is to move people to where they can actually become citizens in the United States.
So Just Neighbors is really kind of a clearinghouse for information and there are probably, three kind of general areas that you try and address: education, advocacy, and then kind of the logistics of helping people kind of boots on the ground.
Right. So our primary mission is the direct services, is really to provide the legal counsel to the immigrants so that they can actually file their claims. That's our primary mission. But in doing that, we've also started an education program, education for the client population, so that they understand what their rights are, whether they're documented or not, so they know how to respond if an ICE agent comes to their door, or if they're pulled over while driving, those kinds of things, so that they know what they're legally entitled to do. Whether they're a legal resident or not, they are protected by the Constitution. So we do some of that kind of education. We also try to educate the community at large. First of all, organizations that serve the immigrant population also need to understand what to do if ICE shows up on their doorstep. And that has happened if they're doing raids and those kind of things. And service agencies in particular where immigrants may be coming for assistance can be vulnerable and can be targeted. The third piece of our education is really the community, the non-immigrant community, to help them understand immigration law. This is an extraordinarily complex set of laws that changes daily. The attorneys will tell me that it's only maybe second and maybe first now compared to tax law in its complexity. And it truly is an individual case-by-case basis. You can't generically say, oh, you qualify for this based on these things. You really have to look at everybody's individual situation to see if they qualify.
Okay, well, let's start there.
Okay.
So, Immigration 101.
Okay.
There are DACA kids, that's a special category. You have the green card holder, that's
Right.
a special category. There's this, what's also, well, we'll talk about those two categories. I also want to talk about this distinction between a refugee versus an asylum seeker. So let's start with the DACA. What is DACA and what is TPS? And let's walk through that first.
DACA and TPS are temporary statuses. TPS has been around a little bit longer. It was put in place by Congress to basically respond to a disaster in another country. So if someone was here, whether they were documented or not, was in the United States, and a disaster or a war, earthquake in Haiti as an example, the war in Syria, it would prevent them from being deported, and would actually give them a status that would allow them to work on a temporary basis. So that was typically for 18 to 24 months was the period designated by that. And the promise was not to deport, assuming they didn't commit any crimes, and it gave them the right to work legally. So they would get a work permit. That permit, based on the State Department and now DHS's rulings, could be renewed. They would extend that. So, for example, the earthquakes and hurricanes that hit Central America in the late 90s and early 2000s, for Honduras, for Guatemala, and for El Salvador, folks have been here for 16, 18, 20 years.
They kept getting their TPS renewed.
And the government kept renewing that status. So until recently, this administration decided that that status was no longer valid. So they attempted to say, this is your last time you get to renew, here's your 18-month warning. There's been a lot of litigation that has temporarily stopped that from being permanently terminated while it's in the courts. So folks are still able to continue to renew that.
But that's still a valid means of being able to stay in the country if you're currently in the country and there's some major act of God or violence that occurs, then this is still a means to
So the 2013 earthquake in Haiti was a perfect example. So folks that were here from Haiti, whether they were documented or not, at that point the United States declared it's not safe to send you back. It would be inhumane to do that. So we will give you this temporary status. And so that has been renewed repeatedly to this point in time. So that is a temporary protection.
Now let's talk about
DACA. DACA is similar. It's the same protection. It's a promise not to deport, and it's a permission to work. DACA was established by an executive order under the Obama administration when Congress really couldn't get agreement on a DREAM Act. This was his way of approaching solving the same problem. So DACA was designed for children who came with parents when they were, I believe it's under 16 years of age, when they arrived in the United States. They have had to have arrived here before 2012, and they have to be continuing their education or working to apply. They cannot have committed crimes. And so when this was initiated in 2012, people could apply, if they met those criteria, they could apply for a temporary status just like TPS. They could get a work permit if they were old enough to work, and they could, it was a promise not to deport. Didn't protect their parents in any way, but it gave them status that allowed them in the state of Virginia, allowed them to get a driver's license, allowed them to go to school with in-state tuition. So, and allowed them to work legally. So for many of them, they were also then working and going to school and supporting their families and doing those kinds of things. So that's also a temporary status. That too is now in litigation, and in fact will be before the Supreme Court in November.
And there's going to be a rally around that.
There will be a rally. I'm sure there will be a number of rallies, but we're getting some of our activists to join us on November 12th.
At 10 in the morning
at 10 in the
Supreme
morning
Court.
at the Supreme Court,
Okay.
Hoping to encourage them to recognize the value of these 700,000 young people who are fully contributing, paying taxes, working. They're first responders, they're teachers, they're doctors, they're attorneys. One of our clients was a rocket engineer at William and Mary. And here's a kid who has the smarts, has the intelligence, and has a lot of opportunity to be a great contributor to this country, but he's in a temporary status.
He's facing deportation.
He's facing deportation if this is overturned.
And then you have the undocumented individual.
So a lot of people think there's a line you can get in. Just, I hear when I do presentations, people will say, well, why don't they just do it the legal way? Why don't they just get in line? And there really is no line. You have to have some pathway to arrive in the United States legally. So it could be by a visa, a travel visa. You could be a tourist. There are millions of tourist visas issued every year that can have you legally come. Those visas usually are 60 days to 6 months in length. If you stay 1 day beyond that time frame, you're considered undocumented. And right now, there's more people entering legally but overstaying their visas than there are actually crossing the border. And that's something most people don't really understand. You can also come on work visas. And there is a lottery that is kind of this random distribution of visas. It's a very limited number that are allocated to different countries, and it's usually based on countries that don't have a large number of immigrants from other sources, like work visas. So like India and China and the Philippines usually do not get the lottery visas, but countries like Iceland or Ghana or some of those countries, there are more of the lottery visas available. So you can apply for a lottery visa, but you wait in your country and you may or may not get that ever. It's pretty random. And if you get that, then you can come and that leads to a permanent status.
Let's talk about, as we mentioned earlier, the difference between the immigrant looking for asylum versus the refugee, and how those are distinct.
So by definition, they're the same thing in terms of what requirements you have to meet. The difference between a refugee and asylee is where the individual is. So a refugee would be someone who has left their home country and is in a second country waiting to go to a third location. They tend to be in a refugee camp, and they're declared refugees because they've met the requirements and they've applied with the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. There's about 21 million refugees in the world today. It's the highest number in our history. There's about 65 million people displaced from their home country, but 21 million of them have been declared refugees by the UN.
Are those primarily Middle East and Africa?
There's a lot of that, yeah. So the Rohingyas in Southeast Asia, a lot of the Syrian population, where any place there's war, famine, a lot of Somalia, Sudan.
And then Central America as well?
Well, those would be more the asylees, because so again, in that case, there's still persecution, or they're still in the same things that would qualify them for that status. But the difference is, for most of those folks, they're coming to our border and trying to cross and asking for asylum. So you can enter legally. You could come on a tourist visa to the United States and say, I'm being persecuted in my home country. I don't want to go back. I'm seeking asylum. If you remember back in the day, the Cubans did this a lot.
Or Russian dancers.
Or Russian dancers, or the Cuban baseball players, those kinds of things, or the Eastern Bloc countries in particular. But that can still happen today if you can happen to get a visa that would get you here legally. If you can't get a visa to get you here legally, then that's where people are coming, particularly to the southern border, and trying to cross. Now, technically, you should be able to go to Border Patrol and say, I'm here and I'm seeking asylum. Right now, there's such a backlog at the border because they're not letting just everybody come through and ask that question and detaining them until it's resolved. They're literally putting a queue in place where people will come to the border, they'll get a number, and they're having to wait 4 to 6 months for their number to be called just for a chance to cross in and say, I'm seeking asylum. If they don't want to wait, or they just feel they can't, those are folks who often will go and try to cross illegally and will literally present themselves to Border Patrol and say, I'm seeking asylum. Sometimes Border Patrol says, no, you can't do that. You have to go back and wait in line. Sometimes they'll arrest them. Usually they'll arrest them and detain them. And then go through that process.
We've seen the high volume of folks who are crossing in this way,
right.
and it's just become kind of a dysfunctional system in trying to find facilities and things like that.
Part of what's happened is it used to be that most of the people who crossed were individual men, and so detaining them didn't seem quite so bad. And what's happened is in the last several years is that families have started coming. Some would tell you it's because of our laws that we're likely to be kinder, and because we don't detain children. There's laws. There was a settlement that basically said children could not be detained more than 20 days with their parents, and they couldn't be detained without their parents. So people decided that maybe we're better off coming as a family. And so what the kind of the old model of detention, where it was usually individual men, changed when it became women and children or entire families. So the administration tried to address that by separating children, trying to make that as a deterrent, which blew back in their face because nobody really thought that was a good plan. And now they've implemented what they call the migrant protocol, protection protocol, which basically once they come through and pass their initial credible fear interview, which is the first step in seeking asylum, they're being sent back to Mexico, the Mexico side of the border, to await their hearings, their court dates. So again, there's not enough detention beds for all the people that are coming. They don't want to release them, even with ankle bracelets, but they do that some, and it depends on the situation. It used to be what they called, which is a really bad term, but catch and release, is that they would catch them, they would detain them, they would put an ankle bracelet on them, give them court dates, and basically let them come into the United States.
They could pretty much go anywhere in the United States, and they could travel perhaps to Virginia, where they might have family members, and just report in that that's where they need to do their.
That's exactly right. So they don't typically stay at the border. They go where they know somebody. So they could have family members in Virginia, or Minnesota, or California, or wherever, and so they would make their way to those places.
And that's still happening, but rarer, much more rare.
It's declining because of the processes at the border are preventing that, but it does still happen because not everybody's detained, not everybody's sent back to Mexico. There are still some that are getting ankle bracelets and being released.
Well, and Just Neighbors was at the Mexican border near Tijuana.
Right.
A few weeks ago?
We were there a few weeks ago. So we were working with an organization called Al Otro Lado. And what they're trying to do is help people as they're arriving to the border, helping them to understand what to expect when they cross. So they're helping them understand that they have to get their number to wait their turn, which is again a 4 to 6 month wait for them to even cross. They're helping them to try to understand what to expect when they go in, what the detention center is going to be like. They're going to be able to keep on one layer of clothing. So wear your warmest piece of clothing next to your skin, because if you have your coat on the outside, you're going to lose that. And you're going to go into what they call the hieleros, which are the ice boxes. So it's cold temperatures. And if you've been out in the heat, in the desert, and so forth, it feels even colder. So people are exposed there. So they try to tell them that. They try to help them articulate their story. Attorneys aren't telling anybody, here's the story you need to tell. And that's one of the things that
That's the
gets
misinformation.
out. That's the misinformation. What they were doing was saying, here's the 5 things you're going to have to show to pass your credible fear interview. You know, who's persecuted? You know, what's the persecution? Who's doing it? You know, what occurred? Did you go to the police? And did you try to move somewhere else in your country? So you have to be able to articulate that to pass that initial credible fear interview. And I, because I don't speak Spanish very well, I was doing a lot of the data entry there as a volunteer, and I was seeing all of these forms that people were filling out. And reading them, every one of them has credible fear. The stories were so disheartening. Entire towns were brought into the town square, and the cartel would say, you either join us or you leave with the clothes on your back. And entire towns would pick up and leave. And so where else do they go? So we saw a lot of people who had experienced that. So, you know, those are the folks that are coming to the border. Most of them, if they tried to move someplace else in the country, these are very small countries. They're smaller than our state. And so those cartels or the gangs are very well connected. Many of the government, police are as corrupt. And so you show up in a new town, the call goes back to your old town that say, guess who showed up here? And you're just as much danger there. So they make their way, hopefully, to get to the United States in hopes that they can escape that.
And the volunteers that went down with Just Neighbors, they're volunteer lawyers, usually just coming out of school, or a variety?
Well, our senior Director of Legal Services went this time and has gone a couple times, and all of our staff attorneys have an opportunity to go. And it's helpful for them because they're getting to see firsthand, as people are coming, kind of what the trauma is that they're experiencing getting to Mexico, if they get sent back to Mexico once they cross under that migrant protection protocol, and just, you know, the fact that there's not any real legal help. There's no U.S. attorneys can't practice in Mexico. So the folks that are getting sent back really have a hard time getting representation unless they know somebody in the United States and can do it by call. So our attorneys have gone down there and just tried to help them. What many of these folks will end up doing is applying for their asylum pro se, meaning without legal representation. So they're doing it on their own. But what the attorneys can do is give them guidance in helping what information they need to collect, what documentation they need to show. So that's what the attorneys were doing. Our attorneys do asylum cases here, so they're not actually taking the cases, but they're helping individuals put together their own case to give them the best chance possible to be successful in their asylum claim.
Okay, and that's on the border. But you do have resources here in Virginia.
Yeah.
You have a number of kind of opportunities for people who are. But tell us about the different locations and what occurs in those locations in Virginia.
Well, our main office is in Annandale, and we serve all of Northern Virginia. From that office, we also have a second location in Herndon, so folks in the western part of the county or out in Loudoun can be served there. In addition, we've started doing some legal clinics in more of the rural areas of Virginia. So, for example, the Eastern Shore of Virginia has a large immigrant and migrant population. Think of the seasonal workers, the people working in the chicken plants and things like that. There are 0 immigration attorneys, private or nonprofit, on the Eastern Shore of Virginia. And it's a 4-hour drive to either the Tidewater area or to here to get assistance. So we've done a couple clinics out there to try to help potential clients. And down the I-81 corridor, we're starting to expand and doing clinics, and we did one in Waynesboro. We're going to be doing some work in Harrisonburg and in the Lynchburg areas. So we're trying to help areas that really folks just don't have access to legal services. And part of the challenge is so many of them have been ripped off by either bad legal counsel or notarios. Notario is a term that is actually a legal profession in other countries, but it's a notary public here that doesn't really carry any legal status. And people may be well-intended trying to help or not so well-intended just trying to get money from folks. And these folks are so vulnerable and so desperate that they'll spend thousands of dollars to get services that people really can't deliver. So they may not have a legal pathway. If we do a screening and determine they'd have no legal pathway, we tell them that, and they don't pay anything. If they have a pathway, then we'll take the case and we work whatever case type that they have.
And you have a 1 in 4 that you help around there?
Well, basically, we just don't have, no one has enough capacity to handle the demand. So we handle about 1 in 4 clients who calls us asking for help. We're just not able to help any more than that.
And I wonder how people can get help and get involved. Your website? and also other specific needs that you might have in terms of talents that volunteers can bring to Just Neighbors.
So we use a lot of volunteers to do our front office work. They actually do the initial intakes. They help us at clinics, and they actually help fill out the forms, so the attorneys aren't doing all the paperwork. So volunteering for those kind of opportunities, volunteering at outreach tables. We use volunteer attorneys to assist in doing part of the casework as well. So there's a multitude of volunteer opportunities, and all of that information and other ways that you can help is available on our website, which is www.justneighbors.org. And so there's stories about our clients, the kind of work we do, all the volunteer opportunities, and other things on the website.
Why don't we have about a minute and a half left, and I would love to hear a success story. Do you have an anecdotal story you want to tell us about one of your clients where we've had an impact, which is the ultimate goal?
And this could be a number of clients, but we have a particular one who came from Africa, and her husband was an African as well, but was here legally, and was abusing her. And her status was dependent on his status for her green card. And VAWA, Violence Against Women's Act, is one of the means in which we can help folks with their documentation. So the husband had the documentation, her status was dependent on him, but he's abusing her. And in many cases, we see this a lot with the violence against women, and it's not just women. The one with legal status uses that status
power.
as a means of power over the individual. So we were able to help her separate her status from him. She was able to get her own green card. She had left several children in Africa. She has now been able to petition and bring them here, and now her grandchildren are here. So she is working, and she has gone to school. She's got a job that she's able to support herself and her family. Her kids are in school and doing great, and that's one of many of those types of cases.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. It's inspiring, important, and needed. Thank you, Erin, for being on the program today.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching On the Go with AAUW.